Ten Commandments, I call them God's top 10. Now, right at the outset, I want to say that the commands of God are divine principles that provide the foundation for a life full of joy, safety, good relationships with God and with one another. So, do we want to know what is right, what is wrong? Then look beyond the commands, look beyond the top 10, look beyond the 10 Commandments themselves to the God who loved us enough that He sent His Son Jesus not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. Let's open up our Bibles to the book of Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20. And today we conclude our mini-series on God's top 10. And we have been on top of Mount Sinai for the past 2 weeks, and we find ourselves once again there, and that's where Moses climbed up that mountain, Mount Sinai, and he stayed there for 40 days and for 40 nights, and God spoke to him these 10 powerful words. We call it the Decalogue, or the 10 Commandments. And today a lot of people think that these 10 Commandments are old-fashioned, that they are out of date, that they are archaic. Folks, I got news for you. These 10 Commandments are just as relevant and up to speed and practical for you and me today as they were in those days when Moses came down off of that mountain with these tablets of the 10 Commandments. And so we have looked at these 10 Commandments in this mini-series. We looked at the first 4 and discovered that they deal with our relationship with God. They deal on the vertical relationship. And I've discovered that, you know what, that's where we start. This is where we do business with God. God does business with us. All starts on the vertical. And we decided that when anything goes wrong in our lives, when our life is not working, when we have problems that we can't find a solution to, and when life doesn't make sense, and when we begin to question what God's will is for our lives, this is where we look. We look on the vertical relationships. We look up first to God, and I've discovered something that when I get this relationship right, my relationship with God is right, then it's amazing how over a period of time, all of these other relationships, all these other problems begin to have meaning and understanding and significance. And so the starting point is the vertical. We deal with the first 4 commandments. And then last week, we talked about the next 3 commandments. And today we come to the last 3 commandments. Now last week we talked about how we are to honor our father and our mother. We talked about the commandment that thou shalt not murder. And we talked about the commandment that thou shalt not commit adultery. And so you might think, well, we got through with all of the tough ones. Let me tell you something. Let's slow this train down a little bit. And on the surface, they might seem pretty simple to understand. God says, don't steal. Well, we say that doesn't bother us too much. God says, don't steal. Okay. Then God says in the 9th commandment, don't lie. Well, we may stretch the truth a little bit here and there. And then God concludes his top 10 by don't covet. Again, on the surface, these last 3 commandments look pretty simple for everybody. I've never heard anyone approach me and say, Dale, would you explain to me what lying means? Lying simply means not telling the truth. Anybody want a sub-definition of lying? This is truth. This isn't truth. And you take the truth and you don't tell the truth, then that's called a lie. Stealing. Well, would somebody like to interpret what exactly stealing means? If I take something that isn't mine, if I take something that's yours, and I take it and make it mine, when I take something that doesn't belong to me, that is called stealing. And God says, don't steal. Now look at this last one, the 10th commandment. We seemingly, I say seemingly, get off easy on this one. God says, don't covet. Don't covet your neighbor's car. Now, to covet doesn't mean you want a car like your neighbor's car. To covet means you want your neighbor's car. So we think that we could probably skip through coveting and these last three commandments. I remember way back, it seemed like a long, long time ago now, folks, when we were in church together. That was March 8th, and on that particular Sunday, a good friend of mine and a good friend of New Hope, Frank Rossiter, he sung a song, and he has a beautiful voice, and whenever he's up in our neck of the woods, he always brings a song with him. And on this particular Sunday, back in March 8th, he wanted to sing a song, What a Beautiful Name. It was a beautiful song, sung in a beautiful way by a spirit-filled man, Frank. And he warned me, he said, Nadell, this song starts out very soft and very passionate, and then he told me toward the end it builds to a crescendo. It gets quite loud at the end. And you know, that's the way a lot of music starts out, if you happen to notice it all. When the song begins, it starts out relatively soft, and then it gradually builds up into a crescendo at the end. Now it seems to me on the surface, looking at these 10 commandments, it seems to me that God would have put these last three as the first three in the top 10 of his commandments. He starts off easy. Maybe with these last three, they look relatively simple. You know, don't steal, don't lie, don't covet. But he ends up with these last three. Instead of being something that we really don't relate to, so we think, gotta tell you something. You know, it may be a very good idea. You might think, well, I've heard enough. I think I'll check out on this message. Don't check out on me yet. Stay till the finish. Did you ever see the movie Sting? It came out years ago. The film Flam Man. Dirty, rotten scandals is what they were. And the movies in real life, the con artists, they are the aristocrats. The sophistication element of crime in America. Just how much these innocent people are victims of these aristocrats who specialize in ripping us off. It remains to be seen how much money they take from us, but I would imagine it's in the billions and billions of dollars. Professional, intelligent, highly precisioned plots are schemed up with these aristocrats, and they steal billions of dollars from innocent people. Recently I read about this little old lady. She lived on a big farm, and she was elderly, and she was living by herself, and she had help to come in 2 or 3 days during the week to help her with the farming and the cattle and so forth. And she, at this particular time in her age, she wasn't thinking clearly like she had for so many years before. And one night, a man was hitchhiking down the highway in front of the farm, and he saw the house, he saw the farmhouse, and so he broke a window and he went in while she was sleeping, and he stole about $600-700. And he left, and they caught him, and he was tried, and he was sentenced to 7 years in prison for breaking and entering. Months went by, and a real estate man from the big city saw that farm, had a lot of acreage, and he found where the little old lady lived that owned the farm, and he went into town and hooked up with a local real estate agent who knew that little old lady, and he had known her for many years. She had lived on that farm. A generation before her also lived on that farm. And the man said to this local real estate man, "You know what, I'd like to buy that farm. It has a lot of acreage, and I could build a shopping center on it, and I could make mega bucks." And so they go in and make an appointment with that little old lady, and they sit down around the kitchen table and having a cup of coffee, and they were talking about stuff, and then the subject of church came up. And the local real estate man said, "You know what, I go to the same church that she goes to." And the man from the big city said, "Well, I go to church also, but I go to a different denomination than you two go to." And the real estate man from the big city shared with the little old lady, "I'd like to buy your farm." And he said, "I'll offer you 50% under the market value. Cash. 50% under the market value." And she had no idea what he was talking about, and so she called her brother who lived out of state, and he said, "Well, whatever you want to do, Dorothy, whatever you want to do, it's fine with me." She called her daughter who was living out in California, and she said, "Mom, I don't know all about that stuff." So she sold the property easily for 50% under the market value. And so when the two real estate agents wrapped up the deal and left the house, they got into their car and they said, "Wow, didn't we make a big deal on that piece of property?" Now folks, I got to ask you a sobering question. When they got to heaven, and the guy who stole $600 because he was hungry and had nothing, and he served 7 years in prison, here's the question: is God going to think harder on him or on these two dishonest real estate men who robbed that little old lady of tens of thousands of dollars? Who do you think the biggest thief was? God says, don't steal. Some say, "Well, you know, Dale, that really is a commandment that really doesn't bother me. You know, I really don't steal." Do you know, listen up, do you know that 2% of the profits are taken away from every restaurant in the country because customers take condiments, sugar, mustard, ketchup? Now I know none of you have ever done that. If I were giving this message in church, I would say present company excluded from that. I mean, I may be preaching to the choir here today. Stealing something that really isn't yours. Employee theft in the workplace is a growing problem and affects many employers. In fact, I have had more than one employer in my lifetime tell me, "Dale, the biggest problem I face running my business is employee theft." So that, as a matter of fact, 95% of all businesses suffer from theft in their workplace, and approximately 75% of all the employees steal from their employers at least once. Walmart, the retailing giant, says that it loses about $3 billion every year from customers who steal. Most companies and corporations, the biggest problem they have is with the problem of the employees stealing from them. They pad the expense account, for example. They take away pencils and pens, and they say, well, you know, they have so many of them, they won't miss this one. And it all adds up. It all adds up. God says, don't steal. I got some money coming in. Oh, you know what? The government won't know anything about it, so I will not report it. Well, we're in the tax season. It's been extended a couple of months, but I'm just not going to report it. They're all crooks anyway in the government, and so I'm just going to not report it. Well, when you fill out your income tax, only you know if it's honest and forthright. Only you know. I remember reading about this college professor, and he told the class, as they were approaching the end of the first semester, he said, now one test will determine the grade for this whole semester. This one test here. So there's a lot of weight in taking this test. He handed out the test to the class, and then he said, I want you to take this test home and grade yourself and bring it back to class. Wow! The class got really excited. You mean to tell me I can take this test home, Professor, and grade myself on it? The professor said, that's what I said. One student raised his hand and he said, Professor, I'd like to ask you a question. What about stealing? What about cheating? Take the test home by yourself and grade yourself? He said, Professor, what about cheating? You know what the professor said? He said, well, you can certainly do that, but you'll know that you'll live the rest of your life with a thief. I don't think there were too many 100% scores on that test. Don't steal. Oh, we say they have plenty. Doesn't matter. God says don't steal. Well, I need it. Doesn't matter. You know, there are only 3 ways that we get things, folks. We work for it, we earn it, we inherit it, it's given to us, or we steal. And some people have a built-in way of stealing if the truth were known. Professionals steal. Doctors, auto mechanics, not all of them, but some of them. For example, you go to a doctor and they say, well, we better test you for these grown toenails, ingrown toenails that you have. Now we'll have to scan these toes, and that's going to cost a couple $1,000, but you know, your insurance will cover that. But we need to protect ourselves, so they say. Stealing. That applies to a lot of professions, folks. Plumber, electrician. I heard about this homeowner who had some air conditioning problems, and he had 3 different bidders come, and they were talking about $25,000, $30,000 to fix his problem. But he knew somebody who worked for another air conditioning company, and he was a young man, and so he talked to him about his problem. He came over and looked at the situation, and he fixed the whole thing for just under $1,000. Who can we trust? Good question. Well, they seem to be honest. They smile. They wear a uniform. They drive a big company truck. But who can we really trust? Lawyers. Some lawyers, I think, will have to live 400 years in order to cover all the hours they billed their customers. Now, back in Moses' time, the book of Genesis, stealing was a big problem from the very beginning. It's interesting, in that era, in the time of Genesis, we read about watchtowers. You had a piece of property, and the first thing that you built, at least one of the first things that you built, was a watchtower. Now, why would you build a watchtower? So you could watch over your property and catch a thief trying to come over into your land and steal from you. That's why they built watchtowers in those days. Another form of stealing was taking a rock that was served as a marker for the boundary of your property, and in the middle of the night someone would come over and slightly move the rock. A couple of more nights went by and he would slightly move the rock a little further away, and a few weeks went by and he continued to move the marker further and further away, and so he was stealing from his neighbor by moving the marker. There was a law against that. Don't touch the marker. Don't mess with it. Respect it. And so God is drawing a fence now to protect personal property. There's a lot of ways people steal. You can steal from your boss. You can call in sick, and when you're not sick, to go home early. Well, I'm not feeling good. I like to check out early. And the main reason why you're leaving is so that you can do something that you wanted to do later in the day. That's called stealing. How about making phone calls on company time? That's stealing. You can steal from the government. You know whether or not you're honest on your tax returns. Did you know that you can also steal from God? The Bible says we can steal from God. In the book of Malachi, the prophet says, will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. And the people said, well, God, how have we robbed you? God said, in tithes and offerings. The covenant I made with you children of Israel is that you take the first 10% of your income and you give it back to me, and I will give you 90% that you can keep, but the first 10% belongs to me so I can do my purpose in the world and in the local church. And you have withheld your tithes and offerings, and you have robbed the Lord. So, lesson learned. We steal from God. We become a thief when we don't give 10% of our income to the Lord. Uh-oh, now we're getting into deep water, aren't we? But honor the Lord with your 10% of your income. Mary Ann and I have been doing that for years. And we can truthfully say that God has blessed us over the years with good health, good family, good life. And this past week we received our stimulus check from the government, and we gave 10% of that check. We gave it as a tithe and offering to our local church. So God says, don't steal. You got that under your belt now? Not as simple and easy as it appears to be on the surface, is it? Then look what else God says. The 9th commandment. God says, don't lie. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. No lying. This commandment is based upon the character of God himself. You get right down to it. Because Titus 1:2 says, there's one thing God can't do. The one thing is God cannot tell a lie. God loves the truth, but he hates a lying tongue. Have you ever read in the book of Proverbs chapter 6, I think it says, there are 7 things that God hates, And in that little list, God says that He hates a lying tongue and the people who speak and spread false witness by lying about their neighbor. God says, of all the things I hate, and He mentions it twice in the book of Proverbs, it's a lying tongue. So, the 9th commandment says, don't lie. Don't bear false witness. You know, folks, God loves the truth. And He hates falsehood. I have told my grandkids since they were very, very small, now they are all teenagers, I have told them, you know, kids, I can handle the truth. Just tell me the truth and we can deal with it. But I have a very hard time handling a lie coming from either one of you 3 kids. So let's look at the lying that we find in our culture today. Here's one statistic. At age 4, 90% of children have learned the concept of lying. An estimated 60% of adults cannot have a 10-minute conversation without lying at least once. And within 10 minutes, the average of 3 lies were told. Americans average they lie 11 times a week. 12% of adults admit to lying regularly. 20% of women admit to telling harmless half-truths occasionally. 31% of people admit to lying on their resume. By the way, do you remember, let's go way back to 2001, George O'Leary, remember who he was? He was made head football coach at Notre Dame. This was his goal in life, to be the head football coach at Notre Dame. And on his resume, he had written down that years before he had played football at the University of Massachusetts. And he said on his resume that he was a 3-year letterman. And so somebody checked back to see about his career at the University of Massachusetts, and they discovered he never played one down of football. He never played football. You know what Notre Dame did? They fired him. They fired him because he lied on his resume. His lifetime goal to be a coach at Notre Dame, and it lasted for 1 day because he lied on his resume. 6 lies are told by men daily to their partner, boss, or colleagues. 3 lies are told daily by women to their husbands, bosses, or colleagues. 60% were outright deception. If we lie and we let a half-truth go by, that's a lie. Now, folks, I won't even wade into the political arena today and deal with some of our politicians who are dishonest and are pathological liars from my perspective. So we got a big problem of lying in our culture and lying in our relational world. And boy, we sure love to gossip, don't we? It's tasty, sweet, but gossip is poison. So we always have to ask, is it true? Is it helpful? Is it necessary? And by the way, am I involved in this? If that gossip doesn't meet this criteria, guess what, folks? Zip the lip. I don't want to hear anything about it. So, also, gossip can be a way of, well, we kind of cover over it with prayer. For example, I would like for you to pray for Billy. Now let me tell you what's going on with Billy. You want to know something? More godliness is done through false piosity than you can ever imagine in the church. So is it true? Is it helpful? Is it necessary? And am I a part of it? If it doesn't meet this criteria, then I don't want to hear it. As President Truman used to say, the buck stops here in the story. The bottom line is that when we use slander in our speech, we get half-truths. You may or may not recall the Battle of Waterloo. Well, I did some research this past week, and Napoleon, well, he's in a war with Wellington, the War of 1812. This was about 1810, and nobody knew who would win the war, and the whole future of Europe was at stake. And so England was anxiously waiting to see if Wellington would defeat Napoleon. And the battle was taking place, and they had no communication like we have today. And so sure enough, the battle finally ended, and somebody stood on the bank there in France, and he gave the signals all the way to England, and he said, Wellington defeated, and then the fog set in. The news went out all over England. General Wellington has lost. We have lost. We have lost the war. Wellington was defeated. All over England. That's what was being communicated. But then the fog lifted, and the man sending the signal said, Wellington defeated the enemy. Totally different story. So God says, tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So help you God, as we take that oath in the courtroom. To tell a half-truth or to be silent sometimes, it's lying. Well, some say, I don't want to get involved. Tell the truth. It's freeing. It's liberating. It's life-giving. God says, be honest. In your relational world, tell the truth. Somebody said, well, you know, I never lie unless I'm under real pressure. Ha! God says, don't lie. Then the last commandment, God says, don't covet. Have we learned yet that enough is never enough? We've sat before our television, and these businesses spend billions of dollars creating a very appealing advertisement of a product, and you sit there watching the commercial, and you say, perhaps, you know, I got to get this. This is exactly what I need. When are we going to learn that enough is never enough? Well, I looked at these top 10 commandments, and I tell you the truth, I had trouble with every single one of them. But then when I come to the 10th commandment, I kind of say to myself, well, this really doesn't bother me too much like it used to. It doesn't anymore, because I rejoice in people's success when they make some accomplishment. I rejoice with those who are rejoicing. And for coveting, that's not really a big problem with me anymore like it used to be. Well, I got to thinking on this, and down underneath coveting, well, you know, it's pretty obvious. This is a commandment that you don't see. You covet what is not yours, but it's not seen. It's buried within the bosom of your heart and your mind. So I gave a lot of thought to this 10th commandment, and then I thought about identity theft. Did you know identity theft is a big thing in our culture today? Did you know that in 2017 there were 17,200,000 reported identity thefts? That's some kind of cyber crime where the thieves take your bank card, your bank account, your driver's license, your social security, and they assume your identity. And then they take a lot of money out of your account. It's called identity theft. That's a big, big thing in our world today. Perhaps some of you may have been a victim of identity theft. By the way, this crime is not new. It goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Identity theft involves all three of these last three commandments we've been talking about. Stealing, lying, and coveting. Goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. The lie was the devil told Eve that if you eat of this tree, hath God said you will die? You won't die. Eve bought into that lie. The lie's right up front. So what was stolen? Eve said, you know what? That one tree that we are forbidden to eat from, that fruit looks really, really good. And I kind of imagine in my own mind, she kind of meandered around that tree, stood underneath that tree, and looked at the fruit on that tree. Now, what kind of fruit was on that tree? Well, there's a lot of different speculations on that. Some think it was an apple, but we really don't know what it was. And Satan says, you mean to tell me you can't eat from that tree, Eve? Now think about it. Adam and Eve, they had everything. I mean, they had the whole shooting match. Everything. The whole world was theirs. They were to be stewards of it. They were in charge of it. That was their portfolio. The whole world, except that one tree. And so what did she do? She bought into the lie that Satan told her, and she stole from that tree. She stole the fruit from that tree. She took from that tree which didn't belong to her, so in essence she took it from God. She wanted it, so she took it. Now, what was behind all of this scenario played out in the Garden of Eve and Satan? A lie was told. She stole. What was the bottom line there? You know what it was? It was this 10th commandment. Covetousness. They wanted to steal God's identity. And folks, that's what we do when we steal, when we lie, when we cheat, when we break one of God's rules, when we sin. You know what? We want to be God. We want to take God's identity. How do we do that? Well, very simply, we want to run our own life. We want to do our own thing. No one's going to tell me what to do. As Frank Sinatra sung the song, I did it my way. Can you believe that I even heard that that song sometimes is sung at a funeral? I have a hard time believing that. Person died and they wanted the song sung, I did it my way. Talk about arrogancy to the core. So when we sin and when we try to live our life without God, we think we know more about life than God does. So how arrogant can we get, folks? To think that I know more about life than God does. Adam and Eve wanted to be just like God. But you know what? They didn't qualify. They didn't have the stuff. They didn't have the equipment. They didn't have the givenness to be God. And when you and I try to say, boy, God, you know what? You should have done this, or you shouldn't have done that, or you shouldn't have let that person die. When we make those calls, we're stepping beyond our boundaries. Principle to learn in this life is this, very simply. God is God, and God is in control. And guess what? You and I, we are not God. And so we try to steal his identity and play God. You know what? It always, always, always ends up in a disaster. We go through our life violating, breaking one or more of these 10 commandments. And the Bible says if we break one of them, we are guilty of them all. I asked 3 teenagers a question. Where are the 10 commandments found in the Bible? None of them knew. And then I asked the same 3 teenagers, well, what are the 10 commandments? You know what? I was shocked. Not one of them knew. Not even one of the 10 commandments. And then I told these teenagers, you know what? You need to write these down, memorize them, and at your young age, you need to adopt these 10 principles for successful living into your character. Because when we follow these 10 commandments, they will build character. We will be known as a person who tells the truth. And we will have good morals when we live by the 10 commandments. And I told these 3 teenagers that you need to develop these 10 principles as your code of ethics and values for living. And when you do that, you will live a good life, guaranteed. Well, what's the opposite of covetousness? The word covetousness means to be passionate about something. So what's the opposite of covetousness? It's content. Learning to be content. Content versus covetousness. Here's what a 14-year-old boy wrote. Here's what he said. He wrote it down. It was spring, but it was summer I wanted. The warm days, the great outdoors. It was summer, but it was fall that I really wanted. The colorful leaves, cool, dry air. Well, it was fall, but it was winter I wanted. The beautiful snow, the joy of the holiday season. It was winter, but it was spring I wanted. The warmth and the blooming of nature. I was a child, but it was adulthood I wanted. The freedom and the respect. I was 20, but it was 30 that I wanted. I wanted to be 30, not 20, so I could be mature and sophisticated. I was middle-aged, but it was 20 that I wanted, the youth and the free spirit. I was retired, but it was middle-aged that I wanted, the presence of mind without limitations. My life is now over, but I never got what I wanted. Wow. Written by a 14-year-old boy. You know what the Apostle Paul said about all this? About being covetous? Well, he was in jail, and he said, I know how to abound. He said, I know how to be on top of the mountain. I know how to be down at the foot of the mountain. I know how to feel the wind behind my back, and I know how to feel the sun in my face. He said, I know how to be joyful and happy. He said, I know how to bottom out. He says, I know how to be abased. He went on to say, I know how to lose everything. Oh, by the way, I'm in jail writing this, he says. But Paul said, because of Jesus. When I'm on top or when I'm in the bottom, I know how to be contented. Folks, that's what our faith in Jesus does for us. That's what He does for us. You want to know something? You'll never be contented as long as one of these three or all three of them are violated, and they are operating so subtly in our lives and in my life. These three little concluding sins of the Great Commandment from Almighty God. So, final thought. What tent do you live in? What tent do you occupy? Is it the tent of content, or is it the tent of discontent? Think it over. Now folks, this is God's top 10. Now in this mini-series, we have just skimmed the surface. It's just been the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. There are a lot more truths that we can share in talking about God's top 10. Maybe sometime later on we will return and revisit God's top 10. But folks, as I said at the outset, these commandments really deal with relationships. And all of us want good, wholesome, fulfilling, thriving relationships. And why is it that there are so many broken relationships in our relational world today? Chances are pretty good that one of these principles has been violated, and it caused a break in our relationships. And I can guarantee you that when we steal and when we lie and when we covet, these three seemingly simple, easy commandments to obey, they're hard to adapt into our character. But nothing will destroy a relationship quicker than we find ourselves stealing, lying, or coveting in a relationship. So, bottom line, you want good, healthy, vibrant, fulfilling relationships? The guidebook's right here, folks. God's top 10 principles for having good relationships with God, our Heavenly Father, and with one another. I pray that you will take to heart the lessons that we have discovered in God's top 10.
Surrender all to Him. I freely give. I will ever love and trust Him in His presence daily. And Jesus,